Hello.
Hello.
This is a workshop on risk assessment. Is that what you're expecting to join?
Yes, please.
Hi, John.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm your note taker.
Oh, hi, Anna.
Just to let you know I'm here. I'll go on to mute now, but just to let you know I'm here.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.
John, shall I start by sharing the slides?
That'd be great if you could, Chris, please.
I will try. I've got them somewhere down here. I think it's those there.
Excellent.
Right. Do you think we should just give it another? I'm not too sure how many people are here. Somebody come out of there.
We've got 19 at the moment, and I think that is broadly the number we were expecting.
Okay. Shall we make a start then?
Yeah, crack on.
Right. Okay. Well, this workshop is focused on effective risk assessment processes, and I'm Chris Jones, and John O'Connor is joining me, and we're going to talk briefly at the beginning about each of our local authorities' responses to guidance on risk assessments. But just to remind you, on the first slide, there are a number of workshop team tips, which we've been sort of practicing already. So we're not going to do introductions, but there's 19 of us, and that would possibly take us 10 minutes to get through. And we've only got 40 minutes, so I apologise for that. But if I think in the chat area, you can add your name and job title and where you're from. That would be useful just to get a feel when we get into discussions where people are from. The session is being recorded like the previous session. So if you don't want to be part of it, turn off your camera and your mic and use chat. Our note taker is Anna, and Anna will help to capture questions which you can ask via chat. Right then. And John reminds me that I'm first to go. Okay then. And then it'll be John. So I think we've got 3 questions each. And the first question is an introduction slide. Okay. Oops, that's gone. Okay. No introduction slide. So I'm talking about Nottinghamshire County Council. And I've put two headings on that slide: risk assessment guidance and temporary changes to send legislation. We started to consider risk assessments obviously before the temporary changes to send legislation, but the two processes have run alongside each other, certainly for the last few weeks. So in terms of risk assessments, what we asked schools for was summaries of their risk assessments of vulnerable children and young people. In Nottinghamshire, in terms of vulnerable children and young people, we asked for risk assessments for those with SEND, including those not with those without EHCPs, but who the school would consider to be vulnerable, but also those who've got named social workers as well. And the focus of those risk assessments, as the guidance laid out, was on attendance and the risk to the child or young person of not attending. And where we asked schools to reg rate their risk assessments, many schools had started doing risk assessments already. We felt it wasn't for us to say they must tear those up and start again. We did provide a couple of examples for those schools who felt they would like an example, but we asked them to reg rate in the summaries, those that were amber, green and red. Also the summaries included details about attendance or not attendance and how schools are maintaining contact with individual pupils. But for those with red, we asked them to provide further details. behind the concerns that school had, and those summaries and those summaries came with the further details about those reg-rated red, and they were passed on to the most appropriate support worker within local authority. So if the child had a social worker, we would pass them on to that social worker the details. If there are any health issues raised, we would raise them with the provider, and if the response was not forthcoming, we'd escalate them through to designated clinical officer for them to raise with commissioners. Just say at this, because I don't think it's on my second slide, we've had no need to escalate any health issues to our designated clinical officers. Alongside that, starting a few weeks later, in terms of the temporary changes to SEND legislation, and the focus being on Section 42, the provision in plans, we started holding structured conversations with parents, carers, and young people where appropriate. So certainly people over 16. I can't claim to have done too many of these structured conversations. We've all joined in. I've done a couple, and I've certainly have done one with a young person. They're quite detailed, and they really explore how the family, the young person's feeling, not only about their provision, but about themselves generally. And so it's a health and well-being check, it's a welfare check, but also asking them about the provision. And now they felt that their needs have been met during this period. And again, we've responded, we've reg-rated those responses and followed appropriately with settings where required. So my young person asked a very specific thing about when they return in September. They've been at college throughout this period. They've been online. That suited them really well. And they wanted to raise a couple of questions about that. And that's been fed back and followed up by the college within a week of those issues being raised. Likewise, with health issues, we've not had any that's needed escalation. We've had some concerns from parents, but at this stage we've not pursued those. Right. So this is just like to summarise. So in terms of risk assessments, we've had nearly 6,000 summaries returned, and of those, 116 have been reg-rated red. The 116 of those that reg-rated red had an EACP. So it's quite a tiny proportion. Likewise, with the structured conversations, as of the end of last week, we'd spoken to 2,100 families, and obviously in some families there's more than one child, and we've identified 84 situations that we've decided they should be reg-rated red. That is just under 4% of the total, and when we started this process, structured conversations, those that have raised concerns have always been under 7%, so it's been fairly consistently low, and our approach has been to start with early years working through to 5 to 16. So what we're actually looking at now are those largely post 16, and some of those are more specialist provision, which we've been in contact from day one. So in effect, we're revisiting those families. So key issues raised by families that they've told us, but this general thing about support with return to settings, and especially around anxiety, and often that's anxiety of the child and young person, but it's also anxiety of parents and carers. And I think as we've moved through June, we've seen more and more children return. So our numbers in our special schools have doubled in the last couple of weeks, from a low base to about 30% at the end of last week. But we're seeing that general movement back into schools. But initially, it is about parent care anxiety and the anxiety of children and young people. The other thing that parents have raised, and these are the sort of the 84 reg-rated red, is the impact of challenging behaviour on the family from their child or young person. A number, but not many, have raised about lack of communications from settings. That is mainly in mainstream settings as opposed to our specialist provision. So they felt they may have been contacted at the beginning, but they've had no contact since. So we've been able to follow that up with the settings. The lack of differentiation of the work set by settings. So, you know, that schools have sent home the same work to all children, regardless of their needs. And also what we've come across is obviously issues that were there back in February, early March, around settings with parents and carers are still there. Okay. In terms of ourselves, lessons learned, very briefly, very a positive response from families. We've had lots of families, and you know, we've had lots of families who thanked us.
Is now joining.
Okay. We've had a positive response. I think what this has led to, and throughout this period, is a greater focus on the child and young person. So rather than focus on the process and getting things done, though we've maintained our timescales in Nottinghamshire, we've had far greater focus. And what's helped that is improved partnership working. So we've got various regular weekly meetings involving colleagues in, for instance, in Children's Disability Service, that yes, we had contacts, we phoned each other, but we never had a formal setting where we shared, you know, our concerns around individual children and families. Greater use of technology, which is familiar now, but we also turn to think about how we might use that in the future. And I think probably the biggest thing long term is the impact on how we'll deliver our services in the future. And I'm very much referring to how we will deliver our, you know, our statutory assessment processes in the future. A much greater focus on the communications with the family, with the child, young person, and less on the processes. And I think that's because we've worked hard on the processes the last few years. And I think the whole experience of structured conversations have shown us that actually, you know, families really welcome that engagement, and we gain a lot from it in terms of helping those processes move more effectively for both ourselves and obviously more importantly, in many ways, the families and children, young people. Right, that's the end of mine. Do you want me to carry on, John, with the slides, or?
Yes, please. Given the small number, it'd be helpful if you could for me. Okay, so just as Chris did, just to set a bit of context about Lincolnshire. So we've got over 5,500 EHCPs, 356 schools in total. That serves a population of about 106,000 children. So you okay to move on? So a bit like the Star Wars movies, there was always a beginning of this. What's interesting is to be able to see quite a lot of similarity between Chris's approach and also ours, but the subtle differences, and I'll try and pick those out and try and give an indication as to why they were. So in the beginning, we're very conscious that had we have gone near our schools and said, bearing in mind that the risk assessment guidance hadn't at this point in time been published, and we wanted to know some detail around all of their children, we just weren't going to get that from schools in those early days, but we really wanted to establish a position for where were our families and where were the children, and how was this impacting upon them. So instead of making contact with schools, we asked our SEND caseworkers to come offline for 2 weeks and make contact with families and ask them around the situation of where the child was, how do they feel that the needs of the child were being met, and if they had any concerns, to establish the already existing channels of communication with us. So one, it was confirming who their caseworker was, so they would know who to make contact with in terms of the local authority. Always specify that in the first instance. It's always best to talk to your school, because they'll be able to help your needs more than the local authority will necessarily centrally. Now that's quite an undertaking, but that allowed us to come up with our own initial assessment of risk. And one thing we are very fortunate about is we only have one single case system that holds all of children's case level data. So all of our social care information, all of our SEND information is all in one place. So we can actually read across and see what risks we might have as to whether we need to have conversations with our social care colleagues, or with those that are in our learning disability team, or those that are in early years. So we came up with a RAG rating system that was for our own internal use. We did not share that with schools. That was for us to have a position statement. And of those, there was only 10 cases out of our 5,500 that we needed to go back to the institute to talk to them around. We've got a different opinion of the safety around the child and where they are at the moment. And those were all children who were currently at home, and we thought they were probably best off in a education setting. The outcome of all of those were they all did go back into school. It was a massively positive response from families. They really didn't think the local authority cared that much to give them a call, which was a bit of a shock in one respect, but a bit pleasant in another, in terms of them being really surprised that we would take the time to do that. So that was a real positive for ourselves, particularly our caseworkers, who they don't always have regular contact with families. To be able to get that additional sort of like daily digest was useful. I think most local authorities have been involved in, or schools have involved with the DFE Daily Returns Survey, and on there you can find out approximately how many of your vulnerable children, by the definitions that they use, are actually in an education setting. So right in those very early days, within those first 2 weeks of lockdown, we were averaging about 15% of our vulnerable children were in schools. Schools did very quickly get on board with completing risk assessments and maintaining them. And one of the things we always asked the schools was, if you've got a risk assessment, well, you will have a risk assessment in place because you must have, but if you've got a risk assessment of a child and that status changes, i.e. the child needs to now come back into school because of a risk status change, you need to let us know. What that meant was our effectively snapshot in time meant it could be updated by regular updates from settings. Once the, because obviously tracking alongside all of this is emerging guidance from DFE at various stages. So once the selected year group return was announced, particularly within primary, so the nursery, reception year 1, year 6, and all those in other year groups with vulnerabilities, then what that meant for us is we needed to once again look at the whole risk assessment process. And last week, we thought we now needed to update. The reason for this is before it was about we had a status in every single child, but now their situations of where they were was now going to change. So our approach was to look at it from two fundamental things. There will be children we already know about who we have concerns. There is a vast majority that we know about where we do not have any known concerns, but it doesn't mean to say that there aren't any now. And then there are a huge majority where there isn't a particular concern for us. So whatever our response was going to be, it had to be proportionate to risk. And we also didn't want to ask schools or parents or anybody that was involved information that we weren't going to act on, because we simply couldn't do it if we were going to be overwhelmed. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So by this time, this is now into the 3rd week for primary schools of their phased return back of year groups. So it's a relatively stable time for them. So we introduced the concept of we now are going to need to know who the children are and where the children are. Because the DFE survey, whilst it was telling us at this point in time that 42% of our vulnerable children are in school, we need to know which ones of those are now if we're going to undertake a further update to our risk assessment. But as we said, the problem was at that point in time we didn't know. So we introduced a survey, absolutely well and truly conscious of the fact that schools do not want lots and lots of surveys. So we as a local authority have kept that to an absolute minimum. And the survey that we launched was pre-populated with all of their children, all of their attributes in terms of their national curriculum year group. And the first question was, is the child in school? It's auto set to yes, which means if the child is, there is no further questions for the school. If the child is in school, that's a normal situation for children to be. So at this point in time, that's not a high risk for us. The other questions ask usual sorts of things. So has the pupil left the school, just in case they have by the time we've generated this data? Is there a place offered for the school? It's parental wish that the child wishes to be at home. That's important for us. Are they maintaining a risk assessment? Auto defaults to yes, because they should. And is the child not attending currently due to illness? That we thought was a reasonable question to ask, in case that would give us further evidence when looking at our case files of those children. It was very minimalistic in terms of information. We've done it in a phased approach, so that went out to primaries last week. This week it is special schools and pupil referral units and alternative provision, and next week it will be secondary schools. For early years and for post-16, we've done that in a completely different way. We haven't needed to survey them. The post-16 has been slightly more straightforward. That usually involves some form of funding, so therefore we've attached it through that particular funding route. And with early years, it's a completely different relationship with our early years settings maintained or private providers. So that's given a sort of snapshot of what Lincolnshire has done. We're hoping to be able to have a complete update on all children through risk assessments by the time that we would naturally see a middle of July time. So that would be just prior to any form of whatever a summer holiday may or may not look like. That's all that I wanted to say about our approach, because I'm conscious of time. We wanted to give a bit more time in our session for questions. So last slide then, Chris. So we've got about 15 minutes before we finish at 3:40 this session. So it's open to questions. If you want to type them into the chat first, if you can. I'm just going through backwards to see those that have. There was one question there, Chris, that came up in your session, which was from Julie Cronin. I think it's from Bedfordshire, or it could be Bedford City, I'm not sure, because I couldn't read the end of it. And what Julie was asking was, what was the RAG criteria that you used on your risk assessment?
Okay, I mean, there was slightly. I got feedback there. Sorry about that. The one that we used, we asked schools to record for their risk assessment, was around about whether the child should be in school or not in terms of risk to themselves. So we're asking, should this child be in school? And if they're not, then that would be a risk. If they're in school, as John just said about in Lincolnshire, that would be the best place. The one with structured conversations, that was much more focused on about, are you happy, not so happy, or not happy at all with the provision that has been provided during this period, in relationship to the provision outlined in the HCP plan. So it was slightly different, and we did, I mean, obviously we've received those RAG rated ones from schools, and we've looked at them and compared and contrasted and triangulated in terms of our structured conversations.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. There's one question which came in from Ian. That's just shot up my list. So Ian Palmer, I believe. Yeah, so the single case management system that Lincolnshire used is Mosaic. We do have an educational database, which is also by the same provider, Serverlec, which is Synergy, but we don't run through any case level material on children through Synergy. We only use that for processing things like admissions. All of our case level, where we as a local authority hold cases on children, is run through Mosaic.
And likewise in Nottinghamshire.
There's one question that's come through in terms of SDN transport in their risk analysis. I'm happy to give you a Lincolnshire response on that. We've got quite an interesting arrangement with our SCN schools is that we have a one service, one provider, and what we do is we contract around all of the children that go to one particular special school as a contract, and therefore they're deemed to serve the needs of the children that go to that school through an overarching contract. So it's very much a provider and special school relationship over meeting those children's needs. So although the local authority will commission that transport, it expects the arrangements to be over what the school and what their transport provider would be. That would therefore form part of the school's risk assessment, particularly over the arrival time of children at school, if they want to stagger them so that they are not all arriving at the same time. There is also a wicked problem in amongst that, is if we were to go towards a solution of moving more of our children into school, then we would need approximately another 1,100 vehicles, of which we're not going to really get that, we think, in Lincolnshire. So that is going to be a wicked problem for us. Although over recent events, the social distancing might mean we only need maybe half that number now. So only a couple of 500.
Yeah, we commission our special needs transport centrally, and so we've been under, we've got a series of guidance for our providers, and like Johnson says, it's with the small numbers at the moment, it's manageable, and there's been quite a lot of flexibility, including with some of our post-16 provision, which have been opened on Saturdays. We've been able to provide transport for that, which would not normally be the case. But like John, we will struggle if all returned in September, especially in the more rural areas of the county, in terms of finding suitable transport.
So there's a question just come in from Anna Jill from Cambridgeshire, which is, it asks about, are you having any children, young people turned away by schools? Are they too complex or the behaviours too challenging with social distancing? I'd be lying if we said we didn't. We have. There have been schools that have even contacted us to say that they're thinking that they can't meet the needs of the children, and therefore almost wanting us to go in agreement with them about the fact they can't offer a place. On some children, it is absolutely the right thing not to offer them a place where their presenting medical condition is going to make them really, really vulnerable. And I do take on board what was said earlier by Andre, but when you talk about some of our obviously very ill young people, permanently ill young people, and they've got real difficulties, then parents generally don't want them in school. The school are really nervous about being able to meet their needs. So if you can get all parties to agree that in the best interest of the child, and again, we do this through risk assessment, if you get agreement with that through all of the parties, then some of those children will remain at home. The one about behaviours, we've had the whole spitting and therefore they can't possibly be in school. We've rebutted those because spitting is a normal part of everyday provision within some of the schools, and therefore it's about using suitable PPE at that particular point in time.
Yeah, I mean, we've had the odd school, we've had the odd parent. I think we've got quite low numbers back. I mean, I quoted our special schools as just reaching 29% at the end of last week, and it would be lower in our mainstream schools. So I think some of those issues will appear more come September, as more parents want their children to be back in school.
There are no more questions that have come through, so either we've done a fantastic job, Chris, or they've fallen asleep.
Hi, it's Anna here, kind of hosting this as a CDC associate. I think that's really helpful, thank you. What's interesting is some of the similarities and some of the differences. you are obviously both here because you are local authority areas that are getting this right, have been invited by CDC to share your experiences. Do you hear from other colleagues, other approaches and things that aren't going quite so well as we do?
I think, and I don't think it's about getting it right or wrong, but I think there are differences between what would be smaller unitary authorities and what, I mean, both Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire are large geographical areas, and I presume rurality forms part of the background in both. Because Nottinghamshire does not include Nottingham City, so you know there's a whole urban area removed. So I think in some other places you hear about much more. You know, we've supported schools. You know, within our sort of advisory teacher service, we support schools on the completion of risk assessments, providing advice about individual children, things like that. But I think in some unitary authorities, they've been much more working alongside schools around the risk assessments.
Thank you. We do have time. Has anybody else got any other questions they would like to ask Chris or John while we are together, or any suggestions or anything like that, and then give them a quick break before they do their next workshop?
Ian Palmer here from the Eastern Region. We've had feedback from some parent carer forums within the region that the risk assessment process has not been carried out in a very person-centered or co-produced way. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that. It's clearly in Lincolnshire phoning every family. Personally, that is a very co-produced and person-centered approach. But I just wondered if you've got any other thoughts about how an authority can make the process co-produced and person-centered as possible.
I think from Lincolnshire's point of view, we tried to establish right at the very beginning that there is, when we started those phone calls, we reiterated to them their route to us, and we also said we would expect them to have routes to their school. What we said to schools was, if you're making any form of assessment on children in terms of risk, that's something you should share with parents and ask and seek their views on it. And preferably that involves regular contact with parents. We didn't specify the duration of that, but we sort of did indicate that there are some that you might be calling a couple of times a week. There's some that you might be calling weekly, but in theory, you should be calling everybody in a couple of weeks to update. So what they're trying to do is invite from parents, not a tell them we still think you should be at home conversation. It's a how are things now? And what we've seen over the time is the number of students that have got an EHCP have been coming back into school. I think part of that's been about the confidence schools have had to bring more and more children in, because certainly now we're at some of our special schools have got nearly 60% of their children back. Others are site limited and are probably in the low sort of like 40s to 50, but some have been able, those with large modern sites have been able to get 60% back. But that's possibly their capacity under the current social distancing rules.
Thank you. We have some questions in the bar. Do you want to look at those, Chris, or shall I read them out?
Okay. So there's one about merging mental health issues that need to be considered for return to school. I mean, obviously parents, I mean, there's a whole thing about anxiety. So we've been doing a lot of work trying to prepare schools and supporting schools around mental health issues. We're fortunate that in large number of our districts, we've got mental health teams and working with schools, and they've switched their focus to looking at supporting children that are returning to school now and in the future. And I think we're probably in the same situation. We've got a lower return of pupils to our special schools. And it varies between the special schools. And it's quite interesting. And it's quite interesting to see which one is which. I don't think it's always about limitation of building space. And actually, some of those with the most vulnerable health-wise have actually got a fair proportion back in. But I mean, there is no doubt we've, as many local authorities have done over the last few years, is we've tried to support special schools to expand as much as possible to meet demand. So some of our schools have, had increases of, 20%, and not necessarily with additional buildings, but rather using existing buildings. So they will be under some significant pressure come September. But at the moment, none of them are, above. I think the highest is probably in the high 60s in terms of capacity. I mean, what we don't know is what the government is going to say about social distancing in schools. We know what they've said about the general population, but I think Gavin Williamson was hinting at something much more flexible for schools last week.
In terms of Lincolnshire and mental health, we've tried to come at this for, this isn't just a particular, say, special school or those children with the HCPs. We've taken a wider approach to this in that this could affect large numbers of children irrespective of their situation. So we've tried to cast our guidance to be quite wide in terms of almost assessing all children for the impact of returning to school and what that will have. That's just to try to stop schools overlooking that some children have found this very, very difficult. Some, though, haven't. They've really enjoyed the experience, and it's reduced their anxiety by being at home. So it's about schools needing to make an assessment of that upon return, on the children returning into school.
We've found some of our alternative providers have through their online offer, they found a bigger uptake by some young people. Actually a better attendance and engagement as a result. And I know in the college, one of our colleges, they're looking at offering, the Microsoft, they provide their curriculum through Microsoft Teams as live lessons, and they will offer that. And I know certainly some students really expressed an interest in that, continuing that they can spend more time at home rather than in college, but actually receive the live lessons that their peers will also receive. So I think there have been some benefits, as John says, for some young people, but there's no doubt others have faced increased levels of anxiety through this period.
I'm very conscious of time, but there's only one question outstanding that we haven't addressed, which is about if the current social distancing rules stay the same, how will we look at a phased return of pupils, how will we look at a return of pupils into special school? And all I can say from Lincolnshire's point of view is we would probably expect them to undertake some form of rota so that all children have an experience of coming to school, but they can't all actually be on the same site if it isn't safe to do so.
Yeah, and I mean, like I was trying to answer that question earlier in terms of we're not too sure what the social distancing rules for schools will be come September. So, I mean, the guidance already suggests rotas around special schools, but we haven't reached that situation yet in Nottinghamshire where any of our special schools haven't got places for children to return who wish to return.
Right. I wanted to say thank you very, very much to our two presenters. Thank you very much for everybody joining us and for all the very useful questions. and for allowing us time to have useful questions, which is great. So we're asking everybody now to hang up, grab a cup of tea if they've got time for it, and to log into your second workshop at 10 to 4. Thank you very much.
Unknown participant is now exiting.